So, greetings all. Thanks very much to my friend the Dean. Thanks to Eric. My name is James Fallows. I'm a writer for The Atlantic. I'm really excited for this panel that is coming up. I'm going to introduce it by saying a word about this event, a word about the topic, and a word about our two panelists, who I think are really ideally positioned. So I've known Eric Schnorr probably longer than anybody else in this room, since the day when he was a young intern working on the White House speechwriting staff with me in the Jimmy Carter administration long ago. And it's been so encouraging and impressive to see the kind of network he has built around the country and around the world. That I think the Greater Good Gathering is a kind of culmination of. I myself am fascinated by the ways in which people interact to get some larger leverage for the things they're doing. I think that what Eric has pioneered in his professional work and in this gathering shows that. I like the way Eric himself and this gathering show connectedness between past and future in a global sense. And we think we were corresponding recently about the fall of the Roman Empire and what that shows for the U.S., about the connection between past and future in a national sense, what eras of reform and dislocation of the U.S. mean for our current era, about connections between the local and the statewide and the regional and the national and the global, which I think we're all talking about the connection between the immediate and the long term, the steps we're taking on climate and agriculture and all the rest. So I think it's, I just wanted to say that I think this gathering is important, worthwhile. I'm glad everybody is here, and so thanks to Eric and everybody else who's made it possible. Now to say something about this topic. In our opening sessions here, we're talking about some central aspects of the economy and society, agriculture, manufacturing, and health, which have been subject to, sometimes benefiting from, sometimes not, technological dislocation. As we'll hear from our panelists, the ongoing theme of manufacturing in particular, which is going to be our subject, is both its centrality in the economy and how often it has been dislocated over the decades, over the century. That's been a theme of the work of both of our panelists. And it's worth thinking as we confront the dislocation of the future, how many of these dislocations we've been through. Through much of the 19th century, we just had an agricultural panel. Most of the U.S. workforce worked on the farms. And I think it was 150 years ago, 1870, which was, as you've written, the last time when most Americans who were employed in farm jobs. Now, of course, it's 2 or 3%. Those jobs have gone away. New jobs have come to existence. The coal mining industry had its peak in employment in 1918, more than a century ago. Those jobs have gone away. Production has gone up. All sorts of other technology has eliminated whole categories of jobs, created new ones, and so we know that these dislocations bring benefits of the material sense in the long run, but in the short term, they mean different prospects for families, for regions, for ways people are accustomed to make their living. And whether societies can adapt to that easily or with difficulty is a huge part of the question we're considering here. So we have a gathering that's about the connectedness of technology and society and economy and the globe. We have a topic that has been an ongoing source of dislocation plus opportunity in the U.S. and around the world over the centuries. And we have two panelists who are very well positioned to help us understand what is coming next, where its best prospects can be accelerated, where its worst prospects might be buffered, and how we can think and adapt. Immediately next to me, the center from your perspective, is Malcolm Frank, who's the president of Cognizant Digital Business, correct? Whose business is in fact helping organizations adapt for the future and how to think about technology. He has a long background in this field. He's a very sought after speaker and writer, background in economics from Yale, and the author and co-author of 2 best-selling books. One is the Code Halos, how do I say it? Code Halos. And the other is What to Do when Machines Do Everything, a recent book whose argument actually is slightly different than you might think, but I'll let him bring that out. And next to him is Jim Davis, who's the Vice Provost for Information Technology at UCLA, and crucially for our purposes here, is the leader of the Smart Manufacturing Leadership Coalition, which is trying to make sure that the next wave of manufacturing innovation is broadly dispersed, has benefits for the U.S., for different classes of people in the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to hear from our panelists in a lightning round discussion how to think about the prospects ahead for manufacturing as it is both dislocated and new opportunities are created. So let me start with you, Malcolm Frank. Give us the big picture from your book about how we should think about what to do when machines do everything.
Yeah, and there's fear. I think a lot of us become neo-Luddites, and so to go back to the Luddites, they were actually right. They were going off in England and smashing the loom. And why did they smash the loom? Because it was going to put them out of job. And the loom could do the work of 40 Luddites. So at an atomic level, they were right. But what did they miss? They weren't very good economists, because the loom was the machine that really fueled the first industrial revolution, and it led to massive economic expansion. So if we were all in a society back then, we had 3 shirts and they all smelled pretty badly, but it led to this expansion, the mercantile trade, all the rest, and with that, it led to massive GDP growth and massive employment expansion in the societies that grabbed onto that. It repeated itself at a larger scale in the second industrial revolution, which was behind the steam engine and the rail networks. Happened again with the third industrial revolution that the U.S. was the prime beneficiary of, but the G8 was as well. And so it was roughly 100 years ago with Henry Ford, and we all know that story. But people are very, very concerned because they look at the growth that the U.S. enjoyed with GDP growth in the second and third industrial revolutions, and they're thinking this time it may be very different. And so if we have these machines that can automate so much, what happens with the automated trucking system? And it turns out now that more than really the last job where you can raise a family at above a high middle income wage with no college degree is in truck driving, and there's a huge population of truck drivers across the U.S. So people start to extrapolate and get very, very frightened. We took a long look at this issue at our Center for the Future of Work, and we actually walked in a bit concerned. In fact, there were 2 Oxford professors, Fry and Osborne, who had put out a study that had a thud effect. It said 47% of these manufacturing jobs are going to go away. That got people's attention. It was a bit interesting. We should note they didn't put a timeline on that, so I learned this back in college. You can argue anything if you just don't label your axes, but nevertheless, it got a lot of folks' attention because it really resonated with a deep fear that folks have. We looked at this in depth, and we actually are fairly sanguine about things, but it's going to require change. It's going to require change in the educational system with regulation and the rest, but there is a way out. We think if you look at employment now, in the next 15 years, there will probably, every job is going to be touched by AI and touched by the bot and technology in some way, shape, or form. About 12% will go away, so there will be massive dislocation. About 75% of jobs will actually get better. So this is being a teacher, being a nurse, being a policeman. I think they will all be greatly aided by technology, but none of those jobs are going to go away. Those people will just get better at their jobs. And there's going to be 13% of jobs that will actually be net new. They'll be created, but we don't know what they are. And I'll just finish with this thought, is if you think of the digital revolution, we are now in the 4th industrial revolution. That sounded like hyperbole 8, 9 years ago. I think everybody agrees with that now. I mean, 7 of the top 10 most valuable firms in the world are digital firms that didn't exist 20 years ago, so something big is going on. But right now, it's only the 2nd inning of a 9-inning game. And if you look at it, it's digital that's fun. On average, each of us in this room spends 4 hours on our iPhones or computers. It's sort of frightening to admit that, but that's the average. And we're doing it on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on these. I think we'll look back historically and say that was a little bit silly, and this was just sort of informational stuff that got into the cracks of the economy. We're about to address the pillars that drive a good society. How do we transform the healthcare system through technology? How do we transform the transportation system? We're going to look back in 20 years, our children are all going to say, It was completely nuts. We had 1.2 million people die on highways every year, just moving around. Those just think that was insane. The educational system's going to go through this. So there's a lot of work to be done. And if societies and economies can pivot to this, we think there's actually some sunshine ahead, but it requires a very thoughtful pivot.
So 2 follow-ups before I turn to Jim Davis. The 1.2 million people dying on highways, is that a global number?
It's a global number.
And a lot of that is China, I believe, speaking as a former driver. whole separate topic. The other follow-up question I have is your very interesting figure that 12% of jobs, everything will be touched, 12% of jobs will go away, 75% get better, and then new ones. That's over what period of time?
We think it's going to be by 2030, so the next decade.
So, and if you think of other decades of rapid change, would that have been about the same pace as the 1870s, 1880s?
That's the key question, because it's the story of the farm to the factory took about 1.5 generations. So this is going to happen in a much more compressed period of time. We're already going through this. Just think of your last week. How many times did you go to the ATM? There used to be a human being doing that. Did you go through an easy pass? There used to be a human being at the Triborough Bridge. If you go to the airport, you just walk through with facial recognition. There used to be people doing that. So this automation has been happening, but it is really going to accelerate.
Great, thank you very much. Now for the complementary perspective from Jim Davis, which I'll set up for just a moment. One of the reasons why there's such attention to manufacturing as a sector in the economy is partly it's the key to future sectors. If you have a supply chain, if you have in-house innovation, if you have all these things, manufacturing today positions you for wealth in manufacturing tomorrow. That's one reason that it's been important. The other is it's been historically a relatively high wage sector compared to service sectors, et cetera. You've been studying the next generation in manufacturing with those benefits of future innovation flows, of relatively high wage positions, et cetera, et cetera. Tell us how we should think about technology's threat and opportunity for the next generation of smart manufacturing in the U.S.
That's the perfect setup.
It's almost as if I had thought about it.
Right. Yeah, as usual, this is an unplanned panel, and throwing out all the remarks, there they go. And we can start in a different way. After listening to Malcolm, I can also say we're aligned going forward. I also started off with the full knowledge. We came from an agricultural panel right before this one, so I'll start off with kind of an example there. Let me start off with the following. An example that's in the food industry. Take a Cheerio. You can look at the Cheerio. If you had a bowl of Cheerios this morning, it's an advanced composite assembly. It's an advanced material. It actually has to meet geometrical tolerances. It has to meet taste tolerances. It cannot have pesticides. It cannot have steel pieces. It cannot be contaminated. It has to be gluten-free. And in General Mills' case, it has to be GMO free. So there's a lot of properties that have to be met for that to show up in your bowl.
Can you put the microphone a little closer?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was aiming the wrong way. Did everyone get the Cheerios piece of it? So from a smart manufacturing standpoint, we take a look at the Cheerio on the the shelf when you buy it from the store. And one of the things that happens is it's far better if they can put the new box of Cheerios on that shelf the moment we buy it. Because if it sits in a warehouse or it sits on that shelf too long, it has a chance of being contaminated. There's a whole variation of flavors and products, and so General Mills in Minneapolis has to actually have a ability to change recipes very fast, work in smaller lots, and work these things with much greater agility. There's a much higher demand on the precision of the operations, how you clean these out, how you sterilize these, and then to use the same words that were used just a little bit ago, if you get into the supply chain, if the materials show up and they sit in the bins as raw materials and they sit there too long, they can be contaminated, have to be thrown out. If they have the wrong material for the wrong product at the wrong time, it could be thrown out. So the waste starts adding up through this. Now you add into this 4,000 suppliers to the General Mills supply chain, all the way to the farm, grain elevators, mixing, transportation, all sorts of things that are along the way. And if you do not mix those right, if you do not build the products right, if you do not pull them from the farms right, if you do not get the certifications right, all of these things can add up into contaminated product that will sit there and be thrown away. If you add all this up from the farm all the way to the shelf, the waste just in this one industry with this one product has an economic value of about 20–25%. And that's just the energy savings from the waste. So when we talk about supply chain productivity, the energy savings is tremendous. So this notion of precision that's being used, this notion of productivity, actually have real effects. So smart manufacturing, if you take these across glass, you take this across oil and gas, you take this across chemicals, cement, you name all of the industry segments, the energy savings and the investment capability here is very high, but it all depends on the data. It depends on the data being shared right, the data flowing appropriately, and so forth, to make this all work. So precision and productivity, just as we heard from the agricultural panel.
And so I have a follow-up, but continue if you have more of a pitch you'd like to make.
Well, I wanted to start with an example. I just start with the example because of the lines here, because how do you work with the data is actually the name of the game. Smart manufacturing to us was coined back in 2005, actually about the same time as Smart Factory in Germany. And we've been tracking parallel paths from a U.S. and a Germany standpoint. Smart Factory in Germany eventually became known as Industry 4.0. It's gotten a lot more publicity, but what's happening in the U.S. is much more emphasis on the data than in Germany, much more emphasis on the energy and the overall environmental effects, energy saving materials, than in Germany. And one of the biggest things here is basically how do you deal with all of, there's a bigger picture here which has to do with energy and materials, because we just can't keep doing manufacturing the way we're doing and then not deal with the overall environment and all these kinds of things from a global standpoint. So there's a very big picture here that begins with smart manufacturing.
So I have two clarifying follow-ups to ask you about before and shifting to another question. One is, it's important to emphasize when you talk about smart manufacturing, people might be thinking, oh, Tesla or spatial. You're talking about very unglamorous products just simply being made in a smarter rather than more wasteful way, right?
Well, I'll pick on the word unglamorous because to me a Cheerio is really glamorous when I really think about it. When I think about it. But to us, the definition of smart manufacturing, we use this following. It's the right data at the right place in the right format with the right technology in the hands of the right people or the machines across the entire enterprise at the right time. So what do you do with data in that following broad view?
And the other clarifying question is, where roughly does the U.S. stand in the arc of applying smart manufacturing technology? I assume we are behind Germany. I'll take that as a stipulation, but it has some other places. How does the U.S. rank internationally in its application of these technologies?
It's a more complicated answer. It actually has to do with the pace of change. One of the biggest differences between the U.S. and Germany, as well as China, is our pressure and our wanting to put the dependency on the market. So it was said earlier that we really want to have the democracy, we didn't think about from a democracy, how do you take these things forward? How do we let the market drive this? Whereas other countries are investing more directly in these. So in our particular case, we're one of 15 institutes that started with the Obama administration. The investment there is about $140 million per institute. 5 of them are with Department of Energy, 9 of them are with Department of Defense. But that's actually about 1/10 of the investment that Germany has put in, from a country standpoint. So substantially less investment, but substantially more interest in driving the market.
Thank you. So now I have a question for you. Your book and your speeches do a lot of historical comparisons. I think is very sensible. We're talking about these waves of technology. You could think about technological disruption sort of a bimodal way, that what we're going through now, either this time it's different or this time it's the same. And so we can learn from what happened at previous times. Can you say between this time it's different and this time it's the same frontiers. Where do you stand, and how does that make you think about how to make the dislocations now less traumatic?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's what history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And so the patterns are unambiguously similar. But here's the real difference. If you look, for example, in the last 3 industrial revolutions, it was all around raw materials. So you had to get the coal to make the steam engine go. And in manufacturing hard goods, there was a real home field advantage that certain nations had. If they didn't have it, they were just going to go grab it somewhere. And it's led to, we could argue, a lot of the unfortunate history of the 20th century. But that was driven by economic need. If you look at what's happening now, we are still going to have to make things. So the manufacturing around the smart products is we think there is going to be a revolution there, and we can go into detail there. But the difference is it's all around brain power. And this is where I think the US is actually behind. And so is the consumer demand there? Unambiguously it is. You go sector after sector, and you can get very optimistic about them. But when you look, and I have this role where we've got about 300,000 employees in our firm. It's a global footprint, so they spend far too much time traveling around the globe. But in doing so, it really slaps you in the face of where the best and brightest are going and what's happening with the educational systems around the globe. And so you go to India, the best and the brightest actually go straight into this industry. They go into high tech and they're going into manufacturing, and they're all focused on STEM. Same is absolutely true in China. It's actually absolutely true in Eastern Europe. It's fascinating. The communist educational system was deeply, deeply STEM focused. And so now we're getting these incredible engineers coming out of places like Romania, the Ukraine, Belarus, even Russia itself. So, but it's interesting that when you go to Western Europe and you go into the US, in the academy, 2 things slap you in the face. One is the lack of emphasis relatively on STEM. It just hasn't captured the imagination as it has in those other societies. And the second thing, which is important, is the misalignment between the academy and industry. And so, if you look 100 years ago, public school systems and public university systems were very clear-headed. Their charter was to create great workers for the new economy. So you could get down to creating factory workers or people who would really work well within the capitalist system and building these organizations. There's this enormous separation now that you hear this terms like corporatism in the academy in the West, that you go to India or China, that just wouldn't make any sense to them. And so there's this incredible alignment that we see in Asia and Eastern Europe that actually doesn't exist in the West right now. So it is about people, and that's the shift.
A brief follow-up before I turn to Jim. A somewhat different impression that my wife Deb and I have gotten when traveling around is the revolution in career technical education at many public high schools and in community colleges and places where there are these sort of cooperative ventures. So briefly, is what we've seen illusory, or do you think there is some kind of revolution?
No, I think actually, if you look at that, the community college system has received the memo by and large in the last decade or so, and so you do start to see that alignment existing there. And when you get into smart manufacturing, 12th grade may not be enough, but 14th grade may be if those kids go into these community colleges and really learn how do you build smart products in a smart factory. And so the community college system, I think, will really be revitalized. My kids would joke, oh, it's 13th grade. No, it's not. It plays an extraordinarily important role in this digital shift.
So, Jim, since you represent a major university, certainly speak on that if you'd like. There's a related question I'd like to ask you too, which is that one of the laments about pressures on manufacturing in the U.S. right now is 2 generations ago, manufacturing was seen as a source of equality and greater opportunity in the U.S. Now there's a fear that technology is driving inequality, regionally, educationally, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about the educational role Malcolm just mentioned, and also how technology can be an engine of inclusion rather than exclusion?
Yeah, so 2 separate large questions. But I'm glad that we're into this. This is the heart of the conversation, what we're talking about here, I think. On the educational side, I will actually agree strongly. even from an institute standpoint, actually, if you look at all 14 of the institutes, we're working much more strongly with the community colleges. They're moving much more quickly than the four-year institutions. And one of the things my chancellor works on is actually how to broaden this perspective and how to work across these kinds of institutions. There needs to be more opportunity and a broader spectrum for the jobs. In the manufacturing, we've looked at what the new jobs look like. They have cyber in them everywhere. We are at our best count right now, which is through one of the other institutes, about 63 new job descriptions that did not exist 3 years ago. So this business of the knowledge side of things is actually taking hold very strongly. And then one other ingredient I'd like to throw in here, which is more of a technical and a market side of it, is everything we're talking about with AI, machine learning, modeling, it fundamentally is about the data and how do you get access to the data and then do something useful and add value with the data. If you look at the market out there, and this will segue into the question, if you look at the market right now, we're at about 7,000 platforms with the cloud coming in. We're at thousands of applications that are multiplying every day. Microsoft is predicting 500 million applications over the next 5 years. And if you look across all of these, they are stovepiping what's happening with the data. It's actually getting harder and harder to get access to the data. And so it's making this manufacturing transition that we're talking about actually harder and harder. So I'm not speaking to all companies here, obviously, but the general rule is we're stovepiping, we're trapping the data as opposed to working on the methods to free it up and then make it available. Doing that actually creates an inequality, and it's the large companies that can actually afford to deal with these new technologies that are taking it on are now seeing these starting to move in, albeit slowly. But the small companies, which actually make up 90% of the manufacturing base in the U.S., have a great deal of trouble accessing any of these technologies, any of these practices, any of the education going forward. And so this equality, it's been growing for a number of years and it's growing faster and faster. So if you take my Cheerios example and the supply chain, most of that supply chain is small manufacturers all the way down to the farm. You need to get this data practice, this capability, this technology in their hands so that they can innovate along with the large companies, and only then can you actually get the benefits across the entire supply chain. But right now, the drivers, the way things are going forward, that inequality is actually growing, and so this is where we use this term democratization of innovation. We have to get this technology in the hands of the small, medium, and large companies in an equivalent way, so innovation can happen everywhere.
And to ask the obvious follow-up from that, if this wave of technology is again sort of making for less fair opportunities, there has to be democratization of the technology and information. Who does that? Is that a national policy, state policies? Is it large corporate leadership? Is it universities? How do you get from now to what has to happen?
This is actually a question for discussion. We believe there needs to be a stronger voice of industry, a collective voice. We believe that our institute or the institutes can actually bring some critical mass to how to change this going forward. There actually needs to be some changes in infrastructure with the way we actually do things with data. Need to be some changes with how we look at intellectual property. Not to say we don't protect it, but you have to think about it differently for this data to be shared and for things to become much more interoperable. So there's actually a multifaceted set of approaches that need, in our opinion, to be put on the table for this to go forward. And it's that collection of things which have nothing to do with, well, they build on the technology, but they're way beyond the technology. That gets at what the pace of change is. And when you look at competitiveness from a global standpoint, you have to ask now the question, will our processes like these move us fast enough with the pace of technology as it's going forward? That's a hard question that we think needs to be put on the table.
So Malcolm, a related question for you. What is your to-do message to a group like this? It's not just business people, but people from various sectors who are influential.
I think it's a couple of things. One is to embrace the change. You don't fight this. This is a wave that is so overwhelmingly large. Make the trend your friend. So you're going to have misgivings. There are always going to be misgivings with this level of change, but I think we need to grab onto it. And there's really three things that these things that always come together. One is rewarding entrepreneurialism. Now, this may seem sort of counterintuitive, but the societies that are automating the most actually have the lowest levels of unemployment. So if you look at what's happening in Germany, South Korea, Japan, and the reason is because they're making better and better products at a different price point, and so they can sell more, and they're creating better jobs in the process. So it becomes this virtuous cycle. But the second piece of that virtuous cycle is what I talked about earlier. They have an educational system that creates workers that can work on smart products and smart factories and really build that manufacturing base. The third is smart regulation, and I think this is the one that we're really gonna have to pay a lot of attention to, is not killing the golden goose of innovation. If you look what's happened, I talked about, we're in a phase 1 of digital, but I think we're about to enter phase 2 where there's sort of a diaspora. It's gonna enter every industry. But phase 1, and maybe it's just because I'm close to it, and it's the narcissist disease. You think your world is so important, but you can draw a line through what's happening with Trump in the U.S., what's happening with Brexit, what's happening with the Yellow Jackets in France, and it's these cities are disproportionately thriving in the first wave of the digital movement. And so in the U.S., that's Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, New York, Washington, Chicago, and the rest of the country feels like you SOBs threw a party and you didn't invite us. And that's happening in the UK, that's happening across Scandinavia, that's happening in France, that's happening in Italy. And so I think it's this economic shift is underlining a lot of what's going on with society and politics. So we can keep throwing food at each other, or we could try to address it. And I think the way to address it is to get these technologies and the education to work in combination with smart regulation, elsewhere across the country. So how do we, and you see some VCs are doing a great job of this, like Steve Case and Renaissance is doing an amazing job of saying, let's not invest in the usual fishing spots. Let's go invest in Birmingham, Alabama, Kansas City, Missouri, and places like that. So I think that we need to continue to push this technology diaspora, and it will be with these manufacturing old line industries. And if you tie those together thoughtfully, I think that we could really see a lot of results.
That last trend is something I've seen in Wichita, Duluth, and Dayton, elsewhere. We have time, I think, probably for one question, if tersely put. Yes, sir.
Just on the regulation question as it pertains to data. So we've just seen Germany put forth a regulation as relates to the ownership of these vast pools of data and the stovepiping by the dominant forces. What is your take on that in the United States? Do you think that's the way forward? Because to your point, if data underlines all of its potential and it's owned by the few, is that a monopolistic situation, and is that something the government should be looking at?
To briefly restate the question before we get into answer.
It was essentially, these corporations have so much of your private data. What do we do about that? And how do we regulate that? Is that sort of?
No, if the thesis is that in order to create more competitive, more modern, smart manufacturing industries, you need underlying data to understand what is going on. It needs to be shared across the ecosystem rather than owned by the few.
How can it be both shared and privacy concerns addressed, et cetera, et cetera? So what's the answer to the stovepiping of data?
Well, it goes back to what from our perspective, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We believe that sort of ownership kind of way in Germany is not the right way for the U.S. We believe it actually has to be driven by value. And what we're trying to do is actually show how that value can be defined and then take that forward and then free things up so that the value can be brought forward faster. So this, again, I go back to this democratization and innovation, because we believe that if you go down call it limited ownership kinds of approaches, it's doomed because of the market forces going forward. You have to change the market. But it raises that question, the pace of change again.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the smart product, I was with a client last week in Europe building smart toothbrushes. So these are IoT enabled. Turns out 9 out of 10 people in the West have no idea how to brush their teeth. So it actually teaches you, monitors, and it takes that data, shares it with the manufacturer, and then it goes through the whole supply chain. So when the bristles are going bad, the battery, whatever, they just show up in your mailbox. So that is a lot of data about something pretty private, just how you brush your teeth. being shared across multiple companies. So there's lots and lots of implications of that, but I think that we have already voted with our fingers and we've already voted with our wallets. That in the last 10 years, we've all traded in so much privacy for these daily conveniences. So I think the genie's out of the bottle. And ultimately, how do we allow consumers to have agency over the data that they're generating? But I think, candidly, it's going to take at least a decade for...
The German legislation at a European level is to essentially democratize the ownership. So it's not so much privacy, but all that data, regardless of where it's from, and we've given it away to the point.
This is one of many tantalizing themes for us to continue discussing this afternoon, the rest of our lives. My experience in live broadcast makes me say thank you so much to Malcolm and Jim. We're on to the next panel.